Well, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Sean Flatley. I'm the president of the Irish American Business Chamber and Network, and thank you for joining us for our 18th installment of our IABCN online webinar series. I've said this every time I've introduced this is a very timely subject, but I think this is actually the timeliest we've had this year. If you think about today's program, will focus on why misinformation and disinformation spreads on social media and how this has manifested itself during the coronavirus pandemic. And on the floor of Congress today, we have Facebook, testifying, and other tech companies, not exactly towards this, but on the antitrust, but it ties into this. And then with this upcoming election and all that's, the issues that we're having throughout the country in different cities. I think this is extremely timely. So a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and available on our website. Please be sure to keep your microphones on mute during the first part of our session. We will welcome questions. Throughout the program, you can submit your questions using the chat function. All questions will be addressed after the formal presentation. So I'd like to introduce for some of you our speaker, Jason Steinhauer. Jason is the inaugural director of the Lepage Center for History in the Public Interest. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a contributor to Time and CNN, an editorial board member of the Washington Post's Made by History section, an advisor to the National World War II Museum. In 2014, he coined the term history communicators, and has worked with colleagues worldwide to create the new field of history communication. His forthcoming book examines how history gets communicated on the World Wide Web. I just want to step back. The reason I mentioned reintroduce, Jason and his group did a fantastic event for us a couple of years back regarding Brexit. And it really kind of spoke to the mission of this Lepage Center, is to bring historical scholarship and historical perspective to bear on contemporary global issues. And it was fascinating just to go back to the 50s and all that and see how all the bunch of history, brought forward into the, what we're facing now with Brexit. So Jason, one last thing, please Google the Lepage Center at Villanova to search for upcoming events. They have events on a regular basis. Please check that out. So Jason, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate it. Good to see you guys. Good to see some familiar faces. I figure today I'll be a little bit on the brief side because this is a topic, obviously, that a lot of people have thoughts about, questions about, something we experience every day when we use social media. So I figure I'll just lay out a few themes in broad strokes, and then we can get to more of a conversation. And as mentioned, I'm actually working on a book on all this that'll come out in spring of 2021. So I'm also just going to tease and touch a couple things that'll be in the book without giving away the entire book. That way it makes you want to read it when it comes out, right? So as mentioned, I'm the director of the Lepage Center for History and Public Interest at Villanova. We do a ton of events throughout the year. We've done events on fake news. We've done events on democracy. We did a whole series last year on revisionist history. So what does revisionist history mean? Why does history get revised? Is revisionist history a good thing, a bad thing, something in the middle? So please do check out our website and join our newsletter if you want to learn more about some of the events that we're doing and how we're trying to bring historical perspective to what's going on in the news and what's going on in the world. Certainly, these days, it seems like we could use all the historical perspective we can get. But in my spare time, I actually, for the past 5 years or so, have gotten very interested in how information and misinformation operate online and on social media. And in particular, I'm really interested about information about the past. So how does historical information operate on social media? What information about the past online is trustworthy, what is not? And how do people decide what to trust about historical information online and what to not? So that's actually what the subject of my book is going to be about. The book will have to sort of look at the broad social media environment and all the information that happens online, and then insert historical information into that context. So how does historical information operate on Wikipedia? How does it operate on Twitter? How does it operate on Instagram? How does it operate in the news media? Those will be some of the case studies that I'm looking at in my forthcoming book, which will be out in spring of 2021. And I can tell you that it is super complicated and incredibly complex. It's much more complex and complicated than I ever imagined it would be when I started looking into this a few years ago and started thinking about writing this book. So we are not going to get into all that today, but if that piques your interest, definitely stay in touch with me, and I'll let you know as more information comes out about the book or other talks that I'm doing. But it definitely connects with what's happening right now around coronavirus, misinformation online, and how information is spreading that is both trustworthy and not trustworthy. So that's a couple of things that I want to talk about today, and I'll show you a couple of case studies, a couple of examples, and then we can talk about what you think about them. So first thing, obviously, there's a lot of information out there, and we all know that, but sometimes it's helpful to actually see it in a slide. Now, this is old. This is already 2 years ago from 2018. So the most recent one from 2019 or 2020 would be even more astounding. But if you just look at some of these numbers, I mean, YouTube users watch over 4 million videos every minute of every day. There are 473,000 tweets sent every single minute of every single day. And Tumblr and Reddit, you know, thousands of posts being put up every single minute. So if you multiply this by 60 to get an hour, and then you multiply it by 24 to get a full day, and then you multiply it by 7 to get a full week, and then you multiply it by a month, the numbers are astronomical. The amount of data that is flying around the internet at any given time is in some ways beyond comprehension. I mean, it's like impossible to actually wrap your mind around some of these numbers. And there is just so much information flowing across information channels online at any given time. It is quite staggering. And so the information that we receive in our Twitter feeds or Instagram accounts or on Facebook, you know, is all part of this massive ecosystem that is being recreated every single day. And information about history, about science, about the coronavirus, about politics is also operating within this broader environment. I think why that context is important is because it's useful to remember that while some information does go viral and spread online, most of it doesn't. You know, when we're looking at that big of an ecosystem with that many messages, the lion's share of them go completely unnoticed. The lion's share of them go completely without spreading through networks at a viral rapid pace. So the stuff that does go viral is the exception, not the rule, right? And most information that you see on your social media account is really only seen by you. If you tweet, you know, 90% of the time, the tweet that you send will only be seen by a handful of people. That number could be higher depending on how many followers you have and what time of day you tweet and stuff like that. If you're on Instagram, you know, most of your posts will not go viral. Most of the stuff that you share will never be seen by anybody except a small percentage of people. So what we're talking about when we're talking about information that goes viral and some of this other stuff that you hear about the news, we're talking about a very small percentage of content in that broader ecosystem. So the question is, what differentiates that content? What allows something to spread through social networks in a way that 90 to 95 to 99% of information does not, right? So that's kind of the question that interests me. And it turns out, and this is obviously a generalization, but it turns out that there are a few things that really seem to spread on social media in ways that other things don't. Things that are centered around conflict, things that are symbolic of some sort of larger story that sort of represents some sort of larger dynamic, things that are novel or unexpected, right? So things that are the opposite of what you would think. Things that are highly emotional. And of course, that could be positive emotion or negative emotion, right? It could be a couple of cute kids hugging in the street, or it could be an angry tirade by some politician. And of course, increasingly stuff that is visual in nature, as we use more things like TikTok and Instagram and other visual conversation and communication platforms. So this is sort of what tends to spread on social media, things that sort of tap into these characteristics, things that are based around conflict, things that evoke emotions in us, things that are novel and opposite of what we expect. And what you may be thinking, or what you may have noticed, is that these items closely resemble something that scholars and I call media logic. So you've probably all heard of, if a dog bites a man, it's not news, but if a man bites dog, it is, right? Does that ring a bell to people? This is how journalists and media folks tend to decide what's worthy of coverage and what isn't, right? Things that are worthy of media coverage are, I'm going backwards here. Things that are unexpected, right? So it's expected if a dog would bite a man, but it's unexpected if the man would bite the dog. Things that are based on conflict tend to get more media coverage than things that don't. The media are also very keen to find symbols, right? A small episode that is sort of symbolic of a larger trend, a larger phenomenon, right? This happens a lot with election coverage, right? A small election in a district in Georgia is somehow symbolic or representative of a broader pattern across the United States between the two parties, right? So it turns out that what spreads on social media is very similar to what makes a good news story for news media coverage. And scholar Andrew Chadwick, who is a media scholar who I reference a lot in my forthcoming book, talks about how to have influence on social media, to have influence in the public sphere, you have to adapt to fit media logic. You have to adapt to formulate your communications so that it will have conflict, so that it will be symbolic, that it will be novel or unexpected, that it will draw some sort of emotional response from the viewer, and of course, be it highly visual. So it's not surprising then, in this media environment where we're getting news updates on our phone all the time, and we're constantly checking breaking news or hearing what's happening, that information on social media that follows this logic or that taps into these questions of conflict or emotion or symbolism tend to go viral in ways that most information online does not. So let's look at a few examples. You all probably remember this from a couple of years ago, right? This confrontation on the steps of the Martin Luther King Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial on MLK Day after the Right to Life rally. I mean, this has all of the trappings of good media logic, right? You get a highly visual confrontation. You get conflict between symbols, right? This gentleman here symbolizes the Trump campaign with his Make America Great hat. And obviously he's a white American. And this indigenous gentleman represents, the tribal nations and elders. And so there's conflict baked into this very visual story. You have the guy here in the back who looks like he's sort of sneering and enjoying everything. So this is a very symbolic, very highly visual, very conflict-laden, emotional type of image, right? And so, not surprisingly, this took off like wildfire on social media and became the subject of a great social media and political storm. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the various pictures, right, there were multiple images from this exchange that happened on the mall. But clearly, the one that was the most emotional, the most laden with conflict, was the one that was used in order to spark and ignite this controversy on social media and then beyond, right? The picture over here doesn't seem nearly as emotional and conflict laden, nor does this one, where this guy's sort of looking away, not even paying attention. And of course, this one here, it looks like they're just having a very civil conversation. But of course, it's this one here which is emotionally charged and highly conflict laden, which is the one that ended up getting circulated on social media for the world to see. Now, interestingly enough, if you do some forensic analysis on this picture and this conflict, it turns out that this was actually spread by foreign social media hostile actors, or foreign hostile social media actors. Whoever it was, and we don't actually know who it was, although we have some guesses, actually took this picture and put it into multiple different social media platforms with multiple different headlines, trying to figure out which headline would be the most incendiary, the most symbolic, the most ripe with conflict. And many of the accounts that were sort of amplifying this turned out to display elements of bot behavior or suspicious behavior. So this is another example too of a real life incident that actually happened, but the way it was framed, the way it was manipulated and engineered on social media was purposefully done by a foreign actor in order to incite conflict and to tap into some larger social phenomenon and tensions existing in the United States as a way to create and incite more division. And so we'll see that as a pattern on social media and by hostile foreign actors in other elements of social media posts and discourse. And we can talk more about all of this in the Q&A. Here's another example, and this is actually from the coronavirus pandemic. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this. This showed up in my wife's social media feed on Facebook. And then the more I looked into it, the more I started to see it at other places. This purports to be an American soldier carrying a donkey across a minefield during World War II. That is false. That is not what this picture is. It turns out that these are actually French soldiers in Algeria, and they are carrying a donkey, but not across a minefield. The best information we have about this is that the donkey actually was injured, and this soldier was carrying it back, not across a minefield, but just across an open stretch of land to their medical tent for treatment. So the caption, the information around this image that circulated online early during the coronavirus pandemic was completely false. But the question is, why did this caption get circulated? Why did this image become popular? Well, the caption that was underneath this at the time was talking about how this picture was symbolic of how people who were taking coronavirus seriously had to carry those who weren't. And those who weren't, of course, were implied to be jackasses, right? So this picture, despite whether, you know, it's historical inaccuracy, it was symbolic, right, of a larger conflict between people who were taking it seriously and people who weren't. And because it was symbolic of a larger conflict, it wound up becoming a social media phenomenon being shared on Reddit and on Twitter and on Facebook and other things. So again, hopefully you can start to see a pattern here, right? The information that starts to spread has to be symbolic of some sort of larger conflict. It has to have some sort of novelty to it. It has to be unexpected. It has to tap into some larger strains of thinking or larger tensions within society. Let's look at this. You probably saw a lot of this early on in the coronavirus pandemic, right? Posts that are being put up about animals returning to various places where human beings had vacated or were no longer in existence. There were a lot of these. In particular, this was about Venice and how dolphins and swans were returning to the shores of Venice after boats had vacated when Italy shut down. Right, a lot of this stuff was completely bogus. A lot of this stuff, for example, there have been swans in the Venice canals for years. So the fact that there were swans in the canals wasn't new. It wasn't a result of the Italy shutting down. But it tapped into some sort of larger discourses that we have right around human activity, around the coronavirus. It became symbolic of the fact that humans are the ones destroying the planet, and if we only stopped our activities, then all the animals would come back, right? It's also highly visual. So you could imagine the swan, the canals without the swans, and then the canals with the swans. So again, this information was not true, it was misinformation, but it spread because it was symbolic and because it was novel and unexpected and because it tapped into some sort of larger discourse in our society about what we're doing to the planet and human activity. There's also, a lot of wishful thinking when it comes to misinformation online. Not all of it is spread by foreign actors or by hostile agents from other countries. There have been a lot of studies and a lot of reporting on studies, and a lot of that reporting has been pretty bad and pretty inaccurate. And actually, this gentleman here just put out something in the Atlantic where he talked about all the misreporting around coronavirus studies, around immunity, around vaccines that came out early in the pandemic in March and April. This is less an example of, hostility or it's just really an example of bad reporting. Science reporting and science journalism is a huge issue, and there's not a lot of good science journalists out there. There are a few, but it's really kind of challenging to find good science reporting. And so, but again, why do these studies and these reports about various things early on in the pandemic, why do they circulate so quickly? Why do they spread? Because they tap into things that we want to hear. We want to know that there's a cure coming. We want to understand what's going on. It's novel and unexpected, right? Some of these new things we're learning about the virus. It's things we've never seen before, things we're not familiar with. And so that novelty and that unexpected nature of it allows us or compels us to share it and spread it through our social networks, even if the reporting may be inaccurate, or if it's oversimplified, or if the complications of immunity and the disease are not fully understood yet. So again, these things tap into larger symbolic questions that we are wrestling with online and offline, and particular pieces of content online will spread if they can tap into those things. The last case study I'll talk about is a study that I'm particularly interested in, and it's a Russian-backed effort to sow discord and debate around vaccines. It's been going on for a while. It uses the hashtag #VaccinateUS, and the way that the campaign works is that they interject, quote unquote, both sides of the vaccine debate into the social media ecosystem. So, accounts that purport to be Americans will, on one side, talk about how vaccines infringe on our personal liberties and, true patriots don't get vaccines. Now, on the other side, the same account will interject into discourse that anyone who doesn't believe in a vaccine is stupid and ill-informed and uneducated and backwards. So these Russian-backed accounts will actually argue both sides, and the purpose is just to confuse the debate, to inflame people's emotions, to tap into larger symbolic tensions within the culture, between those who adhere to science and those who don't, to those who are rural versus those who are urban, those who are Democrat versus those who are Republican. It's a very cleverly engineered campaign. The purpose is just to rile us up, essentially. And, but it's been very effective. It's been going on for a couple of years, and it's obviously rearing its head now during the coronavirus debates, where we have a significant portion of the population in the United States and in Europe who, at least in surveys, say that they will not get a vaccine. In one study, it was actually found that 93% of tweets that used this hashtag were most likely foreign agents or some sort of malicious actor. So these campaigns are purposefully engineered, and they're purposefully engineered to tap into media logic, to be symbolic, to have conflict, and to get us to think that we are more divided than maybe we actually are. So, in summary, the false information ecosystem on social media and online is pervasive. There's a lot of it. It could be misinformation, you know, it could be disinformation. The difference, of course, being misinformation is stuff that is wrong, but not necessarily purposeful. Disinformation is a purposeful campaign, right? So with the Vaccinate US, for example, that is a disinformation campaign, whereas the stuff about swans is misinformation. There's propaganda, there's hoaxes, there's conspiracies, lies, rumors, inaccuracies, mistakes, and of course, there's just bad reporting, as we talked about with the studies around immunity. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and a lot of stuff to be wary of, but more often than not, the stuff that ends up circulating and spreading and going viral will sort of follow a media logic and try to tap into conflict, symbolism, have a sort of novelty and be unexpected, and of course, increasingly just be highly visual. So, part of what I'm trying to work on in my book are some remedies to this, and think about some solutions. So here are 3 easy steps that I'm sort of toying with in my own life. Number 1, don't share any articles on social media. Like, that just seems like a no-brainer to me. The more I look into this, the more research I do, there's just really no reason to do it. You can share the information that you read, but don't share the link. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, it might be an example of bad reporting. It might be a story that bubbles up to the surface because of a misinformation campaign like the Vaccinate US hashtag. But in general, you know, if you read a story or a couple stories about the coronavirus, it's great to post on social media, hey, I just read this story. Anyone else have any thoughts about this, or did anyone else read this? But posting the link actually seems to trigger some sort of cascade within the system. And those cascades don't always seem to be helpful. Plus, a lot of these stories are framed in ways that sort of, you know, are again trying to draw on conflict because it engages readers, are trying to be representative or symbolic of other things. And there's just increasingly a lot of problems with that business model. So I would say my recommendation would be share the information, don't share the link. I would also I always encourage people to find the source, right? So determine the origin of something and look for red flags. When that whole thing came out with the Covington Catholic School and the controversy on the mall with that confrontation between the Native American gentleman and the teenager, the first thing I did was try to trace back the source. Okay, who was the first person to post this? Where did this even come from? And that's when I started to realize that, oh wait, someone has been posting this in several different channels, several different Reddits, under several different headlines, trying to find the most incendiary headline, trying to find the one that will become viral. That to me immediately signaled that this was a misinformation or disinformation campaign, that there was a foreign actor behind this. And so I refused to share any articles about it until I understood where it was coming from. So it involves a little bit of like pausing and checking ourselves and maybe checking our emotions, but always try to find the source before you just sort of start spreading or sharing something. And then the third thing would be look for the media logic behind any story that might be trending on social media. Ask yourself, why is this trending as opposed to something else? What conflict is it tapping into? What is it supposed to be symbolic or representative of? Why was the story framed this way as opposed to another way? Usually the story has been purposely framed in order for it to go viral on social media, because that's how magazines and newspapers these days track success, right? The more viral stories they have, the more advertising dollars they can sell. So look for the media logic behind a story. Ask yourself why this piece of information is going viral as opposed to another piece. And that will help to untangle some of this web around misinformation, disinformation. If you're really interested in going further, on our Lepage Center website, we actually have a guide to specifically historical information online and what is trustworthy and what isn't, what things to look for and what to not. We've shared this with classrooms across the Philadelphia area as well as across the country, and a lot of teachers have told us they have used this in their classes to help students evaluate information on social media. You know, can I trust this YouTube video? Can I trust this Wikipedia article? Is it accurate? Is it authoritative? So this is a guide that we have been putting up on our website, and I can put the link in the chat so that you can find it. I've also put the link down below if you want to just grab it and bookmark it. And again, this will be, a lot more of this will be in my book, where I really start to dig into information about the past online and on all these various platforms, and try to untangle which of it is trustworthy and which of it is not. So as I said, these are complex issues. I'm still sorting through some of this in my own thinking and research. I got a book coming out in probably April of 2021 that will go into all this. We'll see where we are in 2021 with misinformation online. We'll see what happens in the election in November and what happens with the social media platforms. Obviously, the question of regulation of these platforms is a huge part of this, right? How responsible are the platforms for the information that gets circulated? What regulation can be put in place? And those questions are very different depending on whether you're in Europe or the United States or in China and other places. So all that stuff is still things I'm still sort of sorting through as I finish the book. But I'd love to stay in touch if you're interested in this and you want to know more. And so here's my contact info. Despite what I know about Twitter, I am still on it, although increasingly I wonder about that decision. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and I have a website as well. So that's what I wanted to share this morning, and I'd be happy to take any questions or dive into a conversation. Thanks for listening.
Jason, I thank you. That was fantastic information. If you don't mind, I'll start off with the first question. That Covington was kind of interesting, that you pointed out that it was foreign actors that were involved. But then it seemed to get life, obviously, in the news media, which I'm not I haven't followed it that closely, but I know there was lawsuits regarding defamation or anything like that. So has the news media gotten better or worse in vetting what they're pulling? Because they want to be first out, right? And so I think that's really but this is great. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, has the news media gotten better or worse? I would say it's hard to make a generalization, but I would say at best it stayed the same. And the reason is, well, there are several reasons, but a big reason is the business models, right? So this is something I talk about in the book, but you know, news media, journalism, they are all under severe financial pressures. And right now, the business model is engagement with stories allows them to charge higher advertising revenue. And higher advertising revenue obviously brings in more money that they can use to fund the business operations. So stories that are based on conflict, that are highly symbolic and highly visual, tend to have greater engagement. Right. On social media and on traditional media. So it puts news organizations in a difficult spot because they know what types of stories we all click on. And if they don't produce those types of stories, someone else will, and someone else will get those advertising dollars and they won't. So I think part of this starts with us. We have to help journalism change their business model. And that's why I advocate not sharing links on social media. Because that will disincentivize these types of stories and this type of reporting. The more we share things on social media, all that stuff gets reported back to news organizations. They have literally hundreds of people in a newsroom who track what is circulating and trending on social media, and then they use that to dictate which stories they will cover, which stories they will stay with, and which stories they will continue to feature. So this story, for example, got so much traction on social media that editors decided they needed to run with it. So they ended up focusing on this story for weeks, which, you know, I'm not sure that this story actually merited weeks of coverage, but because it was getting a lot of views on social media and because people were clicking on it, it compelled them to put more resources toward it. So it's this cycle, you know, and because the the news organizations are under such financial strain for income and for views, I think that the responsibility falls on us. And we have to be more responsible in types of stories that we each individually share on our social media platforms. And I think that's why it's also important to look at the source. Like, as I mentioned, when this story first broke, something about it just smelled suspicious to me. So I actually spent a fair number of hours trying to trace back where it came from. And that's how I figured out that it was someone on Reddit posting this exact same story into 12 or 13 different subreddits, all with different headlines. And I thought to myself, that's not normal. Like, a journalist wouldn't do that. This is someone who's trying to rile us up, who's trying to tap into some sort of conflict and get something to go viral. So it takes a little bit more effort on our parts, but I think the change has to come from us. Does that answer the question?
Oh yeah, I think it's fantastic.
Sean, we have a question from Jean. Jean, can you unmute yourself and
yeah, sure.
ask your question?
I did. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is a good business opportunity for entrepreneurs, or maybe I should patent this one if it's not out there, but is there any rating system by user with user-generated content? Is there any app that you can use to plug in a story like this one in any of them and have users collaborate on whether it's real or not? I know there's snoops and hoax, and oftentimes I see a headline or something and I go to those websites and plug it in and see if I can come up, is it real or not real? Is there any app that you can recommend, or is it not out there yet, where users can collaborate on, this is fake, this is good, you know?
That's an interesting question. One, of course, the internet is so huge. There probably is something out there that I don't know about. I can't claim to be knowledgeable about the entire web. I mean, there's so much stuff going on, you know, not just the United States, around the world. With this much data going around, I'm sure there's something, although, you know, you've obviously cited the fact-checking, the official fact-checking sites such as Snopes. I mean, there's a lot of articles and research about how fact-checking doesn't actually work all that well, which is a whole nother subject of conversation. But what's interesting about your question is because in some ways that's what the web is supposed to be in general, right? I mean, that's what Wikipedia is. Wikipedia is a giant user-generated fact-checking device, right? Basically, someone randomly in the world starts an article, then someone else randomly in the world comes in and says, oh, actually, here's a way to improve this, or here's some additional information, or actually that's wrong, let's take it out. In some ways, what you're describing is what Wikipedia was based upon, this idea that there could be a sort of collective crowdsourced wisdom that would determine what was real and what wasn't, and create some sort of master database. But I think what we're finding out is that that premise might actually be somewhat flawed. We may actually need like subject matter experts, historians, scholars, you know, people who write books to get to the bottom of this stuff, because there's sort of a limit on crowdsourced wisdom and how effective it can be. So I think that's one of the things I talk about in the book about Wikipedia. It's sort of one of the interesting things about how it's evolved. That sort of vision was very much behind Wikipedia, but I'm not sure it's fully been able to live up to that even in 20 years of existence. The other thing I'll say is that, like, you know, this confrontation definitely happened. I mean, it was a real event that happened on the mall. The question is, why did it become this inflammatory, incendiary phenomenon on social media? Right? And that is because of how it was framed, how it was deliberately engineered by actors to be something that would tap into the American culture wars, our existing tensions, our existing politics, right? So there's also this distinction between, you know, when you say real and fake, I mean, this really happened. I don't want to leave you with the impression that it didn't really happen. What I'm interested in is, why did this particular exchange become such a social media phenomenon when others like it did not? And so that's what I'm trying to get to the bottom of. And, you know, there are ways that you can engineer these confrontations to become viral on social media. And the way you do that is by tapping into this media logic around conflict and symbols.
Thank
Kevin?
you.
Thanks, Jean. Kevin, do you want to ask your question next?
Sure. It dovetails to some degree with Gene's question and your answer, but and it's more asking for commentary. Uh, I listened to a podcast in April by Dan Carlin. Who, you know, Dan Carlin, he from Hardcore History and
Yep.
Common Sense, and he made the point that we are, when we look back at this time period in history, we may be looking at the time period when radio became widely available through until now as almost a singular event because of the mass distribution of information, and that our future in a lot of ways is determined on how we come to grips with it. And he made the point that some of our current political issues are really driven by the current inability to come to grips with the sheer amount of data that is out there. And I'm curious as to your reaction to that. You know, whether you agree first, and secondly, what whether there are things that can be done on a mass basis, not just an individual basis, to come to grips with this, with just this massive flow of data, some of which is accurate, some of which is not, and some of which is in between. That's a long statement and question, but hopefully you get the gist.
Yeah. So my first reaction is to always be skeptical of anybody who claims to know anything about the future. I mean, think about this year, right? I mean, we were all sitting around in January and February, and we had ideas about what 2020 was going to look like, and then we were all completely wrong. So I'm always skeptical of anyone who claims to make any claim about the future. And what future historians or future citizens will think about X, Y, Z. I mean, I think those types of statements make for good radio programming, but I don't take them particularly seriously. And of course, this assumes that we have a future, which I know is a really dark, bleak thing to say, but we have no idea what's going to happen. We have no idea with what's going to happen with this pandemic. We have no idea what's going to happen with global climate change and the future of the planet. So for how many more generations will there be future historians? I have no idea. I think it's also interesting to look back in history, right? Because every time a new media form or new media technology comes out, there is a panic around it. And people will say, this is going to, future so-and-so will not be able to deal with this or that, or, this is going to ruin everything, or this is going to be the death of humanity. I mean, when the printing press came out in the 1500s, it was deemed by some people to be a catastrophe. And how is the world going to handle all of these printed books? Whereas before, only a select few people had access to books, right? And those books were handwritten on vellum and other things. Television, right? We're all familiar with that, the vast wasteland. It was supposed to destroy humanity, destroy society. Radio, there was similar rhetoric around radio. There was similar rhetoric around the telegraph and the telephone. So, all these new technologies and these new communications tools that come out, they seem to inspire some dread and unease in us. And they seem to bring out prognosticators and others who worry about the future and how we're going to cope with all this. It's not to say that those concerns aren't warranted. It's just that this seems to be a pattern in human history, right? So I think we have to take them all with a little bit of a grain of salt, particularly when they're coming from, folks like Dan Carlin, who I respect a lot for what he's done. He's built an incredible platform for his history podcast, but Dan Carlin is a journalist. I mean, he's not a scholar. He's not a researcher. He doesn't really have any background in communications theory or history of communication. So I think we also have to sort of interrogate the source a little bit there. He's an amazing podcast host, but that's what he is. He's a podcast host. He's not a scholar. He's not a researcher.
Yeah. Well, luckily, he's at least honest about that.
Yeah. And I don't begrudge him for it. I congratulate him for it. I think we just have to recognize where he is and where he sits. You know, in terms of what we do about all this, so we have this problem in other arenas, right? If we think about global climate change and the environment, we have a huge, massive problem that requires collective action. But collective action is really difficult because there are different parties, different stakeholders, different interests. So then it becomes incumbent upon us to take individual actions. And if enough individual actions add up, then we might have some impact, right? So we can take individual actions by turning off light bulbs when they're not in use, or by using energy efficient light bulbs, or by using, you know, gas efficient vehicles, or maybe switching to an electric vehicle or switching to solar. These are all individual things that we can do, but if enough people do them, then we start to have some collective action that can make a difference. And I think there's a little bit of an analogy here, right? The ecosystem has become so enormous, right? And these platforms, particularly Facebook, which has 2 billion users and is a multi-billion-dollar company, it's not going to go away anytime soon, right? So that we have very limited ability right now to police 2 billion users on any particular platform at any given time. But there are individual actions we can take. And if we take those individual actions collectively, perhaps we can start to see some impact. So I think that's kind of where my thinking is right now. In some ways, the genie is out of the bottle a little bit on some of this stuff. Maybe if we want to take you know, more aggressive actions against social media 10 years ago, we might be in a different place, but we didn't. So this is where we are now. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take some individual actions, and hopefully those individual actions will snowball into collective actions.
Great. Are there any other questions for Jason?
I guess I would just add for the you know, the Bill of Rights and Constitution, free speech versus what a conundrum, you know, this is in the world. And it's just amazing how these bad stories, like individual actions could be, we all boycott CNN and Fox, you know. It's like, this is really, really a difficult, challenging topic.
The question of speech, right? When I was in Europe last year talking about this with people in France, and when I was in Lithuania talking about this 2 years ago, you know, Europeans are much more comfortable with censoring speech than Americans are. And, you know, that is obviously baked into our DNA with our Constitution and the First Amendment. But it does raise interesting questions about speech in various cultural contexts. You know, in Europe, for example, there is very little tolerance for hate speech, particularly, you know, in a post-Holocaust era, in places like Germany and France. You know, there are serious consequences when you participate in hate speech and anti-Semitism. We don't quite have the same thing here. You know, we'll drag people on social media, maybe someone will lose their job, but the consequences of hate speech in the United States versus in Europe are very different. And there are also different regulatory allowances in different countries for speech. Obviously, China censors speech in ways that doesn't happen in Europe and don't happen in the US. You know, and these platforms, they're international, they're global, they exist in all these countries. So, you know, do you have different requirements in different countries depending on the jurisdictions there and the culture there? Can you say some things in the United States online and not say other things online in Europe or in Russia or in Africa or in Latin America? It becomes exceedingly complicated. I will say, though, I'm not a scholar of the First Amendment. I'm not a legal scholar. I don't know the case law. But in very broad strokes, you know, we do place limits on speech when we feel that speech is harmful or threatening or will cause injury to others. For example, you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. And so I think we are in a moment now where we're sort of grappling with what are the norms, both legal and cultural, around speech. What is permissible to say? What isn't permissible to say? Who is allowed to say it? You know, if a Twitter account is saying things that are quote unquote permissible and normalized speech, but then it turns out that Twitter account is a Russian agent sowing disinformation, is that Twitter account still protected under the First Amendment? It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. This is fascinating, and I probably speak for most of us on here when I say I would love to continue the conversation for many hours. It's the type of stuff you can talk about for a long time. But thank you. This is really wonderful, and it's obviously not just interesting, but incredibly important work, and we're thrilled to be able to have you present to our membership. But before I close things out, is there anything coming up in terms of the Lepage Center's activities that you want to highlight that you haven't already addressed?
Well, we're doing everything online now, so we're still sort of navigating and figuring out how that's going to work for the fall. So I would just say stay tuned to our website and our newsletter and our Twitter, and we'll be posting information soon about the types of events that we can do and pull off in this environment. And if you want more information about the book, or if you want to stay in touch and know when it's going to come out, I put my website in the chat, jasonsteinhauer.com. You can send me a note there. I'll add you to my personal list. And then I'm also on LinkedIn if people just want to connect there. And so as more stuff comes out about this particular issue, I'll probably post it on LinkedIn. I try to keep the Lepage Center and my own personal research and scholarship sort of separate. I don't want to conflate the two. So stuff about the book, stuff about misinformation and all this stuff will probably just be more from my personal accounts. The Lepage Center will probably focus on some other issues this year. We're still sort of figuring out what those will be.
Yeah, we'll be sure to share some of those updates on our chamber feed as well. So please make sure Alana is aware also. And thank you again to you personally, to the Lepage Center, and to Villanova, who've been very big supporters of ours. Just in terms of upcoming events, next Wednesday, we have another virtual event, another webinar, which involves immediate expense reduction and best practices. So please take a look at that for anyone who's interested. And thank you again for joining us this morning and having this very important conversation. And be safe, everyone.
Thank you all. Really appreciate the chamber and all the work that you do. And it's great to be collaborating with you all. So we'll hopefully see you all soon. Stay safe.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.